Did Carson Beck hold Georgia back in 2024? As I've been reflecting on the season, I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been thinking about how much Georgia's offense struggled over the course of the year, how much it struggled in certain games, and I'm going to go through the games and give you a recap. But Carson Beck didn't play as well in 2024 as he did in 2023. That's the nicest way to put it. He regressed, and Georgia's offense as a whole regressed. It hurt not having certain guys out there like a Brock Bowers, but it's an offense that when you looked at it on paper ahead of the season, you thought it was going to be pretty good. And Carson Beck had expectations to be a Heisman contender, to be a national champion, to be a potential number one pick in this upcoming NFL draft. Those were the expectations placed on him. And if you ask me, those expectations were probably a little unfair to Carson and unrealistic. Yet, that's what we were dealing with, and that's what was put on Carson Beck's shoulders. And his play was all over the place. He was erratic in 2024. He hurt Georgia in huge games. He didn't get help sometimes. The offensive line didn't play that well. Georgia really didn't have a running game. So you can sit here and play both sides of it, but the side that I want to talk about today is that he hurt Georgia's offense on more than one occasion. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post talking about Carson Beck, talking about if he held Georgia's offense back in 2024. Why am I talking about it? Why am I reflecting on this? Last video I did, I talked a lot about Gunnar Stockton. I talked about, is Ryan Puglisi going to push him for that starting job? Is he going to, make this a competition? Is he going to push Gunnar to the limit? And then I was thinking about how Carson was the starter. And then I was thinking about how different the team felt when Gunnar Stockton took over the job. How much energy there was in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. How the way that they rallied behind Gunnar Stockton. The way that the team really loves Gunnar Stockton. It wasn't as reminiscent in that way when you think about it with Carson Beck. It doesn't remind me of the way that they viewed Carson Beck. It reminded me a lot more of the way that they viewed Stetson Bennett. And I can tell you for a fact that 21 and that 22 Georgia team, those guys love Stetson Bennett. They wanted to fight for him. They wanted to win for him. They wanted to win and lose with him. They wanted all of that. And that is kind of the vibe that you get out of Gunnar Stockton. Is Gunnar Stockton as physically capable of a quarterback as Carson Beck? I don't know. I don't think he has quite as talented of an arm as Carson, to be quite honest with you, just from everything that I've seen. Is he as good of a quarterback? We're going to find out, right? That's what I think we're going to find out. We've still only seen Gunnar in limited time this season. But I think when you think about how this offense just didn't rally around him, and then it got better in November. So there are counterpoints to it, but I'm going back and thinking about it game by game. Clemson was good, right? They do their job. Carson looked really good against Clemson, not in the first half, but in the second half, he was dicing up the Tigers. He diced up Tennessee Tech in the first game at Sanford Stadium. And then it started getting bumpy when we took the 7-hour road trip up to Lexington, Kentucky, and Georgia had to play its first night game of the season on the road at UGA. It got dicey. 13-12 was the final score of that game. The sole touchdown was a rushing touchdown by, I believe it was Branson Robinson actually in that game. Trevor Etienne had a couple big runs. Carson was just, it wasn't 62.5% is not good enough for Carson. And that's a number I'm seeing on here multiple times. I'm seeing 56%. I'm seeing 54%. I'm seeing 53.9%. He just wasn't completing passes. He wasn't seeing the field the way that he saw it the year before. And that really started against the Kentucky Wildcats. I mean, boy, he missed some throws. He missed a throw that should have been a touchdown to Dylan Bell. He just couldn't get anything going. And then the boogeyman was up next. Georgia had to travel to Alabama after that bye week. You think, hey, Georgia, are they going to shake off that close win against Kentucky? Is that kind of a wake-up call, the way that it felt like the Missouri game in 2022 when Georgia went up to Columbia and won that game 26-22 and was trailing almost the entire time? That was a wake-up call, and it felt like you kind of found out a little bit about the championship DNA of that 2022 Georgia Bulldogs squad. That's what we were thinking about it as at that point in the seaon. Heading into the Alabama game, Georgia, number 1, number 2 team in the country. Will they just shake off that bad offensive game where they didn't run the ball as well? Obviously, Carson is struggling in the passing game. And they go to Alabama and he throws 3 interceptions. And yes, it was the game of the year. Yes, he did a lot to get Georgia back in that game. Yes. But then, again, you think about, well, they had to, the only reason it was happening like that is Georgia was getting boat raced. And part of why they were getting boat raced by the Crimson Tide was the fact that he wasn't seeing the field. And he was throwing bad interceptions. We're talking about interceptions that people that are bad at football video games throw. And they're throwing it to just straight up throwing it to the defense. Those are the kind of interceptions that Carson Beck was throwing. They weren't good ones. And they were costly. And Georgia clawed its way back in there. He ends up throwing the ball and throwing an interception at the end of that game. I know it was the game of the year. I know it was great. As a, in the non-biased sense, it was awesome. Awesome football game. It wasn't awesome for Georgia, and Carson Beck really costed them in that game. 27 for 50 with 3 interceptions is not good enough. It's not. I don't care about 439 yards and 3 touchdowns at that point. He played a much cleaner game against Auburn, 23 for 29 the next week. Couple touchdowns, 240 yards. That's the kind of game you need out of Carson Beck. Georgia ran the ball better that day. And then he followed it up. Georgia threw it almost 50 times again. He throws for 459 yards. He hit a lot of deep passes. I didn't think he was super accurate on some of them. And he throws 2 bad interceptions against Mississippi State. And it's just like, now this is happening against potentially the worst team in the SEC at home. So the saga continued there. Followed that up with the Texas game. Right, we head out to Austin. And boy, you could argue that one of the interceptions wasn't his fault, but man, he just wasn't careful with the football, and that was a problem. Georgia won in Austin because of defense, coaching, and a couple of really nice plays by Trevor Etienne. Those are the things that won Georgia the game out against the number 1 team in the country in Texas at that time. It wasn't Carson Beck. So I know this is kind of me crapping on Carson Beck. This is what this is about. I'm just reflecting on the season and reflecting on the fact that this team rallied around Gunner. And I'm not saying that Gunner would have done a better job than Carson. Don't misconstrue my words. But he wasn't good for Georgia last season. And I think that a reset is not the worst thing in the world with him hitting the portal. He followed up the Texas game with 56%, with the Florida game where he threw 3. They were the worst of the interceptions, the ones against the Florida Gators. He crumbled in his hometown, and it just didn't work. I thought it started getting better against Ole Miss, and then he played pretty well against Tennessee, and then he threw Georgia back into the game against Georgia Tech, right? And then Georgia's offense couldn't do anything in that first half against Texas in the SEC Championship. He was 7 for 13 with the 56 yards. He ends up getting hurt. He held him back. And that's just point blank. It's not just the numbers. Obviously, the numbers aren't good when you look at them. It's what happened. He didn't get help from these receivers. There wasn't a lot of cohesion, right? Aaron Smith, Dylan Bell, everyone's dropping passes. That doesn't help. Georgia having one of their historically worst rushing years in a long time. That doesn't help. He, at the end of the day, wasn't good enough in 2024 to overcome the inefficiencies in Georgia's offense. And I'm not saying Gunnar Stockton is or was. I'm not saying Ryan Puglisi will be that. What I'm saying is maybe it was worth giving a shot and turning and giving the keys to somebody else. At the end of the day, that was a Georgia football defense to me that was good enough to win a championship, a coaching staff that was good enough to win a championship, and an offense that had the pieces. Had experienced receivers, although they just weren't as good. Had good tight ends. Had an offensive line that has the guys. It just didn't work together. Had talented running backs, even though they were getting hurt all the time. And it had, a quarterback that was throwing poor interceptions. He picked things up in November. But man, Georgia's season would have played out a little bit differently if they win that game in Alabama, where Georgia was clearly the better team last season. But that wasn't the case. So I start to look back on this thing and think that, yeah, Carson really did really did hold Georgia back. I'm not saying there was necessarily a solution, but I'm saying he wasn't the solution either. Thanks for listening.